Hi, everybody. Today, we're going to start talking about vernacular medieval drama. So the word vernacular, let's just start with that. What does that mean? Take a second and think about that. Vernacular is the language that people speak as opposed to the official language that law or medicine or the church uses. So the official legal language throughout Europe was Latin, but the vernacular language would be whatever the older version of our languages are. So in England, it's Middle English. In France, it's Old French. By the Middle Ages, middle of the Middle Ages, you go from Old High German to Middle High German. You get the picture. So it's drama in the languages that people would understand. So when you start to have vernacular drama, you start to have plays that are made for the people. Even though they're still religious, they are much more public and probably much more indicative of what the general culture was at the time. So really, we're starting to see this at about the middle of the 1300s, which is interestingly about the same time that the plague hits most of Europe. I haven't really thought about that before, but that's when you start to see it. And really, that's actually a time when languages and other writing in those languages really gets going. So there's a kind of literary flourishing that happens in a lot of the European countries in the 1300s, where more writers are writing not in Latin, but they're writing literary efforts in their own languages. A lot of the Arthurian romance things are written in that time period. And when I say romance, it means quests. It doesn't mean quite so much like love. Chrétien de Troyes, you may have heard of him if you know French. He wrote a lot of the sort of Lancelot and Arthur and Guinevere stories. Chaucer is in the late 1300s in England. Boccaccio is in Italy in the 1300s. So there's sort of a literary boom going on where people are saying, hey, the language that we speak can be literary, because there had been literature before, but that had been in Latin. So there you go. Generally speaking, we're talking about plays that were performed outside of churches. They may have used church land to perform on, but they are in streets, in fields, in courtyards at an inn. We're talking about a much more public kind of theater. Like I said, they're still religious and they're still biblical. Not all of them are biblical, but they're all still religious in their matter. And generally, you can divide them into these three different categories. One is stories that are based on the Bible. Those are sometimes traditionally been called mystery plays. This is a very old-fashioned term, but you may have heard that. You may definitely have heard that. They are also sometimes called cycle plays or Corpus Christi cycle plays. It is true that some of them are Corpus Christi cycle plays, but some of them are not. So vernacular biblical drama is probably the more accurate term to use. There's also so we will be talking a lot about those. There's a category that we won't talk very much about, but it's important that you know that they exist. I guess it's important, which are the saints plays. So there's a lot of plays where the legends of the saints, especially a local saint or a saint who has a connection to a particular locality, like the church has one of their bones as a relic, which would make it a site of pilgrimage, then you might have a play about that saint. And so since most of the saints have pretty dramatic endings to their lives, because most of them became saints by ending violently, not all, but most, they make some pretty entertaining drama. And then the third category of the vernacular plays are sort of widely described as morality plays. And I'll talk more about that. So what we're going to be dealing with here is mostly kind of the category of the biblical plays or cycle plays. And then later we'll deal with the category of the morality plays. And you're going to read one of each. So there's been an awful lot of studies of the cycle plays. And that's one of the reasons why the name for them has changed, because there were certain assumptions that were made about them, and those assumptions have been challenged. So mystère is, mystery seems to come from the French term that actually was used to describe guilds, the unions that would, the cobblers, mystère, the guilds. And because these plays are very frequently, the way that they are divvied out in a town is by guild assignment. That's part of the reason why the word mystery got attached to them. I guess they obviously, in a way, the entire Christian story is a mystery. Like, how can that be? Maybe that, but I think it's really more to do with the guild association. Regardless of that, the key things to understand about this are that we're talking about huge civic undertakings in kind of in the same way that we saw in ancient Greece with the festival. So you've got people, like almost the entire town is in some way associated with doing one of these big cycles or big long biblical plays. Because if you're going to tell the entire story of the Bible, which is not entirely this case, but literally these plays begin with the creation of the earth and they end with the last judgment. So when we're talking about a cycle of plays to tell all of the kind of crucial stories from the Bible, we're talking about probably 16 hours of material to perform, depending on the version that you've got. So even if you were not in a play, you might help make some costumes for your husband's play. Or if you were not in a play, you might help build the bits and pieces of set that were needed for it. And you certainly would be expected to come out and watch the play. So pretty much everybody in a particular town would be involved in some way with it, kind of like Christmas pageants are in churches, where everybody with kids is somehow dragged into it. So the way of producing these plays that is most commonly repeated in books and in discussions of them is that these particular plays would be farmed out to the guilds, and each guild would have this play that they kind of owned. And when it came time to perform them, then they performed them, and they performed them every year. And they didn't really change very much from year to year. You would have a place, you would be responsible for saving your stuff, for keeping your wagon, for, storing costumes and set pieces. And not that there was a lot of set pieces, but you could store everything and you're responsible for it. That is the way it was done in some places, but not every one of these big old cycles seems to really be associated with guilds, and frankly, then we don't really know how it was done exactly. But we shouldn't assume everybody did it that way. So in the English canon, and we're going to primarily talk about the English plays here, because that's the language you speak. You have 4 main cycles, and that's the one from York, the one from Chester. Those were both done in the guild structure. And then there are these other 2 funny things, the Townley plays and the end town plays. And they are not the same as York and Chester. So we can clump York and Chester together as plays that were done similarly. Their production was similar structure. These other 2 guys, I don't even want to talk about them right now because they're different. So to understand the way this drama works, part of what you need to do is kind of wrap your mind around how largely illiterate audiences in the Middle Ages understood the Bible and understood how, how they processed information. And one, just because people couldn't read didn't mean they might not have stories memorized. There's evidence to this, but that being unable to read doesn't affect your ability to memorize. And there's lots and lots of evidence of people being able to quote things that they heard. We have, I think, largely lost that skill, but oral, in the sense of AURAL, oral understanding and oral comprehension and oral learning was a skill that people had. They really had it very well. So that's one thing. So this, the other thing has to do with how they learn things visually. So just because they couldn't read didn't mean that they weren't able to read images. And the juxtaposition of images is really important. So this is an image here, kind of not the greatest thing to look at, but it is from what they called paupers' Bibles, which really meant that they really weren't for paupers. It really meant that they were for not church people. They were for regular people. Frankly, this one looks like it would be pretty expensive. So it might be something that a more rich family might have. But the idea was that, yes, there is some text here, but the story is being told largely through images, kind of like a graphic novel. And in fact, what do you do with a graphic novel? What is a good way for a kid to learn to read is through some sort of graphic picture with a little bit of text. But this doesn't tell one story. It talks about, it's telling the story of the sacrifice of a son. So you've got on the left, if you're reading left to right, you've got the left is Jacob lamenting his son Joseph. So if you're familiar with the Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat story, this is at the point in the story where the brothers tell Jacob that Joseph is dead. And the story of Joseph is seen from the Christian standpoint as what you might call a precursor of resurrection. Jacob thinks Joseph is dead, but lo and behold, he's not, and he's sort of reborn metaphorically. Then we have in the middle, and clearly the middle is the most important by virtue of all of the stuff around the picture and the fact that it's the middle, it's Christ being placed in his sarcophagus. So I think what you can see in the background of it, that has to be Mary, the Virgin Mary, because you can see a halo and she's got the traditional, what would be blue head covering. And then you have over on the side, from the story of Jonah being thrown to a whale. And so Jonah, again, is another precursor, what they would call prefiguration of rebirth, because Jonah is going to get spit up from the whale. So you've got two Old Testament stories that feature youngish men being apparently sacrificed, but being reborn. But these pictures are from the moment of their demise, as is the picture of Christ. So you can imagine that in this same, I don't know, I'm just speaking up, I'm just guessing, that in this same Bible of paupers, Biblia Pauperum, you might find the image of the Quem Queritus, when the Marys come and discover that Christ is not in the grave anymore. You might have a picture of Jacob and Joseph being reunited, or Jonah coming up from the whale. This is all what they refer to within Christian belief in the Middle Ages as typology. Jonah's a type for Christ. Joseph's a type for Christ. Now, what on earth does this have to do with drama? And I could talk for like 3 hours about typology, but you don't want me to do that. So what this means is that at any point where somebody saw an image on a church wall or heard a reference to these characters, and there's a lot more. Abel is one of, as in Cain and Abel, he's one of the big ones too, as being a type for Christ, as is Isaac, who Abraham is asked to sacrifice. Anytime their names would have come up, people would have understood, oh, yeah, I understand that story from the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament story. Now, if you happen to be Jewish, that might be offensive. You might be like, why can't the Old Testament stories exist for their own sake? Because people like St. Augustine said, well, what? So if we've got this new religion and we have this New Testament and it's really quite different from the Old Testament, what do we do with the Old Testament? And they went, well, actually, we can see parallels. And that's really ultimately how this happened, was this is how men sitting around trying to understand the Old Testament and the New Testament decided that they were going to understand it. It was through this lens of the Christ story. Whew. I think maybe you need to take a break now after I said that. So do that and come back. Okay, so typology and being able to see connections between Old and New Testament is a way that people, kind of no matter their literacy level, were able to that's how they processed all of this information throughout Europe. So I'm speaking now about the Feast of Corpus Christi, which is a Catholic thing, so it's throughout Europe. We will eventually get to Asia, and there's definitely parts of the world that we are not dealing with in this class, but I am trying to cover 2,000 years, so I kind of have to zoom in somewhere. So in the 1300s, as the importance following taking the Eucharist and communion, taking communion became incredibly important, okay? Especially after the 1100s, when church council said everybody needs to take communion at least once a year. So most people would only take it once or twice a year, usually at Easter. Well, there was this woman, this nun, who had this vision in the early 1300s, I think, of it would look like the moon, and this question of why am I not worshipped, and why isn't there a festival for me, and sort of started this, hey, that wasn't the moon, that was actually a communion wafer. That's the legend behind the Feast of Corpus Christi, that eventually it gets going. So Feast of Corpus Christi means it's the feast of the body of Christ. And the communion wafer represents, in fact, becomes, in the Catholic Mass, becomes the body of Christ. In non-Catholic Christianity, the communion bread or wafer represents the body of Christ. In Catholicism, it is transformed into it. So we could digress into a conversation about the most important for individual, one of the most important sacraments in the Catholic Church is actually cannibalistic, but we won't digress there. So this feast, this festival grows in popularity in the 1300s, and it is a celebration of the Eucharist. Why the heck would we want this celebration? Because without the body of Christ, there's no salvation. So if it's this one thing, hey, this is so important, everybody needs to do it at least once a year. If you think about the sacraments, baptism, the last rites, marriage, ordination, communion, there's probably more, but I can't remember them off the top of my head. Those are all things that happen once in your life, theoretically. You are baptized once. You are you die once. You get married once. you were ordained as priest once, but you can take communion regularly. And in the Middle Ages, that would mean at least once a year. So it actually is a pretty good personal marker, and it really is something that ought to be have a festival and ought to be celebrated. So Corpus Christi as a festival is a moving festival, and this, like Easter, doesn't have the same dates every year. Corpus Christi is the same amount of weeks after Easter. Maybe it's 7 or 8 weeks. I can't remember, but it doesn't really matter. What ends up happening is that it happens in May or June. And that's generally a time where there's pretty fair weather and days are relatively long. So performing outdoors, there's more time and there's better weather. As at the beginning of these festivals in time, as they are started up, processions are really, like parades are very much part of them. And this is true all over Europe, that you have these floats that represent different key moments that all kind of add up to the life of Christ, or the celebration of Christ's body. Because that's the whole crazy thing about it. Regardless of what you believe, the crazy thing about Christianity is, hey, the Son of God became man. He became a little baby, just like everybody else. And he lived a man's life. That is the really sort of fascinating hook that Christianity has. So celebrating that manhood in a way. And then somewhere along the way, these sort of floats that might be what you call tableau vivant, they might move. You know, it might be a bunch of people in a position, and then maybe they move to show something that happens next. Eventually there are plays, and if you want to speculate on how you move from a living tableau to a play, you're totally welcome to do that. It kind of makes sense. And in fact, it actually, it's what seems to repeat itself from the Greeks to the church drama, coming from songs that somehow turn into plays, that the mimetic impulse to act something out just seems to be in us. So eventually, by the time we get to the late 1300s, we are seeing these plays, and probably because of the procession, because these floats would have been representing all of biblical history, or at least episodes from beginning to end, the plays do too. And I have a feeling it never occurred to anybody to go, oh, if we're going to do plays, why don't we redo it? Because that's not the way things work. Structures evolve, political structures, artistic structures evolve because we did something before, and now we're going to do it this way. They don't tend to get remade completely. So for the plays that were performed on Corpus Christi, this is the milieu into which they are injected, or out of which they developed. They don't have to be done on this particular festival, though, but very frequently this is the festival that they are associated with. So you get the term Corpus Christi cycle plays. That's where that term comes from. One of the many that gets thrown around. This is a 19th century image of that seems to be of the Chester cycle, or of living tableaus that might have happened in processions. It's very difficult to figure out when somebody in the 19th century is doing a picture, what they think they're doing a picture of. So take a look at that. Hit pause, take a look at that, and see whether from an iconographical point of view, like when you look at that, what does it look like is happening? And who might be on stage. So hit pause and spend a minute or two trying to decipher that. So what I see is somebody whose hands are bound in front of them. And it's center stage. And I'm ignoring all of this, okay? And I see somebody that looks like they have some sort of power. There's what might possibly be a scepter. It could also be a weapon. It's also somebody that happens to be dressed in medieval clothing, by the way. And then what looks like high church officials over here. Also medieval church officials. This is the symbol of Christ, right? We've got the this is the Chi-Rho, a representation of the cross. And I can't remember off the top of my head all of the symbols, but that image with the cross through it, like a cross with a cross through an X through it, it actually represents also the first letters of his of CR or XR. This also kind of sort of looks like there might be somebody on a throne back here. So if I were to guess, this looks like a really weird amalgam of various scenes from Christ's Passion. So watch, you know what, if you have never seen Jesus Christ Superstar, it's really going to help you if you don't know the story, to just watch Jesus Christ Superstar. The Pharisees, the high Jewish officials, the high Jewish priests are from the story of this, from the standpoint of the story, they are kind of the scapegoats of the people who start this. Hey, we don't like what Christ is doing. He's getting a lot of attention. He's sort of pulling people away from the teachings of our temple. We need to stop him. In the Middle Ages, those high Jewish officials were dressed as high Christian bishops. Everybody generally in these plays was dressed as their medieval equivalent. So you're not going to see Romans wearing Roman armor. You're going to see somebody like Pilate looking like a medieval lord or medieval king. So that's what I think is going on over here. I think potentially these are representing the Pharisees. This guy that looks like he's on a throne, it might be somebody representing Herod, king of the Jews in the Middle East. He was sort of the Herod and Pilate being the two figures of authority sanctioned by the Romans, Pilate being the Roman governor, Herod being sort of the local king and threatened by the idea of a new king of the Jews. So, I mean, this is a fun idea. What if that is Herod here and this is Pilate, and what you've got in one picture, and this is why it would be like almost like a living tableau, is the Pharisees arrest Christ and they bring him to Herod, who says, I don't, this is a Roman thing. Go see Pilate, or vice versa, right? And then Pilate, I think Pilate says, go see Herod. Herod goes, nothing to do with me. And then Christ goes back before Pilate. And then that's when the story of Pilate washing his hands is, I wash my hands of you. If the Jews want to arrest you, I'm not going to step into this. That's what I think that is. I think that's a living tableau that could be moved. Christ could literally go, look at the Pharisees, look at Pilate, look at Herod, and you could actually summarize that whole little section of the Passion in one tableau. And I've never looked at that closely before, so there you go. Okay, so most people, when they read about this drama, think that it was all done on pageant wagons, which look a lot like, this is basically a pageant wagon, a fairly small hay wagon with some structure put on top of it. right? So that's generally what we're talking about with a pageant wagon. And the wagon is on wheels, so it can be moved from one location to another on like a parade route. And each guild would have their own wagon with their own set pieces on it, and they could move it. They do their play, and then the plays move on to the next place in town where you would do them. This image that we were just looking at is clearly kind of almost like the town square. You can even see the way that, and there's a big crowd. Obviously, these folks back here are not getting a very good view of the show. But that's this 19th century artist's rendition of it. A lot of these towns actually have very tiny streets, and so the wagons moving through them, one is it's fairly tight, and two, the audiences are not going to be that far away from any of these things. In fact, they might be hanging out in the houses, looking out through windows. It's very apple blossom, except that is religious. So that in York and Chester, that's how the plays were done. Here's these plays, they belong to the guilds. The guilds have their wagon and they do their play here. And then they drag their wagon along and they do their play in the next spot, and they go to the next spot. That is not the only way to do it, though. There's some evidence, and this is part of your group, next group, maybe it's individual project, has to do with this. There's some indication that in some places you had a playing space like a town square or a field, and all of the performers came and did the play sequentially in one place where everybody was located there.